Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Eric Helms back on the show for another interview. And I don't think Eric needs any introduction. In fact, I believe that the majority of you, if not absolutely everyone, will be delighted to know that this is only part one of our two-part conversation. In this particular episode, we are going to discuss a recent scientific paper where Eric was one of the primary authors, and this is titled Effect of Small and Large Energy Surpluses on Strength, Muscle, and Skin Fold Thickness. And you get Eric again in the next episode as well. How cool is that? So, thank you for tuning in as always, and let's get straight to the conversation. Dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have Dr. Eric Helms back with me. Eric, you were my first guest and it's great to have you on again.
It's a huge privilege and a pleasure to be the first guest and to be back on. It means I didn't ruin the podcast, so that sounds pretty good.
I will have you know that your podcast was the most listened to for a long time until Dr. Bill Campbell happened. So
Yeah.
you've got to try hard this time to gain the crown back.
Oh man, you can't compete with Bill, and you don't want to. He's just too damn nice. So you know what? I'm happy to be second fiddle. We'll see how this goes, though. I have a good feeling about this conversation.
Me too. In episode number 8, dear listeners, Eric and I talked about the basics of hypertrophy, and today I wanted to have him on again because there has been quite a lot of research published on hypertrophy actually in the last couple of years. And the first piece of research that I wanted to ask you about, Eric, is actually your most recent, if I'm not wrong, preprint study, which is titled Effects of Small and Large Energy Surpluses on Strength, Muscle, and Skin Fold Thickness. So the first topic is going to be gaining phases. And my first question for you is, before we even get to the actual paper, what were your thoughts on what an adequate surplus would be in a gaining phase before this study?
Yeah, one of the motivating factors to actually do this study back when, believe it or not, we started planning it in 2018. Yeah, it took a while to get this one through, thanks COVID. Was that there's not a ton of research on this, and the research we have is to some degree limited. We had some studies where you had a relatively aggressive approach in relative novices. You had some studies in athletes, but they were also still performing their sport training. There's some line of research by Ina Garth. Um, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that as an American. Garth. It's probably like Garta, but I'm gonna keep saying Garth. And there's some other work as well. Dr. Tinsley had an analysis out of their lab a few years ago, but when you kind of cobble it all together, there wasn't a clear unifying message. The study that I felt was probably the one to kind of hang your hat on the most was the research by Gartha, and it seemed to indicate that the disproportionate benefit you get from increasing calories to try to gain muscle mass faster was not really worth it. So, just as kind of a brief summary of that, they brought in dietitians and they had this mixed group of athletes essentially take their normal sport training and just slap an upper lower 4-day split on top of it. So upper lower, kind of almost like your traditional like standard bodybuilding program. Um, compound lifts, moderate rep range, etc. And then they brought in dietitians and said, "Hey, let's get you into a quantified surplus, and I'll help you do that." And then the group that was the other group was kind of told, hey, put on some muscle, follow the same training program, but do this in a more self-guided fashion. And what that resulted in were these individualized approaches to gaining weight at different rates, and that were set to individual targets. So it's a very translational study. And on average, the group that was led by dietitians were eating 600 calories more than the group that was doing it on their own. And you kind of saw the difference between like a 0.2% of body weight gain per week versus something like three times that. Um, and when you look at just the raw mean changes, you are seeing larger increases in muscle mass or lean body mass, I should say, because it was DEXA in the group that was led by the dietitians, but it wasn't that close to significant. And the
Mm,
main significant change was substantially more fat mass gained in the group that was eating the 600 calories more, to the tune of like a five-fold difference. Um, and when we know about how there's an obligatory increase in lean body mass when you gain fat, there's been some good methodological work, actually by Tinsley and colleagues and others, that's basically there's a small component of fat tissue that does have lean mass. So there are changes in lean mass, even if you lose or gain pure body fat when measured in DEXA. Um, I'm less confident that there was actually a meaningful or real difference. Strength performance was also not significantly better in the group that gained more. The only performance difference is, if I recall correctly, I think their sprint time went down because basically they weighed more. So they had a little bit of chonk off the starting blocks. Is basically the interpretation there. Um, and so yeah, you basically see this disproportionate, like I mentioned, outcome where the additional surplus didn't seem to help them.
mhm,
Um, so as these being trained athletes, they've got some S&C background. Probably the closest group that we had to kind of the two approaches and a little more directly assessing the experimental design.
mhm.
Um, that was kind of where I was hanging my hat, and I was expecting, like, we need more research on this. I'd like to see it in groups that are just here not to enhance their performance in sport with S&C, but just trying to do a weight gaining for the purposes of muscle mass and strength gain. So I was going into it expecting that the higher surpluses would not prove beneficial, but would increase fat mass more. That was the hypothesis I had working going into it. But
Mhm.
that we might see some indication that there was also some benefit for higher surpluses for muscle gain, but that it wouldn't really be worth it was kind of the calculus that I had in my head.
That makes sense. And then, so you said that this previous study that you were hanging your hat on by Garth or Garthe, or I have no idea. I am Italian, so between the two of us, I don't think we can figure out the pronunciation. But anyway, this study had participants who were probably the closest possible to the kind of participant that we would like to see in a study. So more somebody who's more interested in bodybuilding type specific training or hypertrophy specific training. So in your study instead, in the method section, I was reading that you had 21 trained lifters. And I was wondering, what do you mean by trained?
Good question. So yeah, we typically use two different aspects to delineate someone as quote unquote trained. We have the strength standard, and then we also have a time spent in the gym standard. And we find when we use those together, we really make sure that we don't have someone who's been kind of working out for a while, but maybe not using progressive overload. And we also ensure that we don't just have someone who's freakishly strong, but's actually been in the gym long enough.
Mm,
So it's not a perfect system to have those two overlapping criteria, but it does help. It does limit your sample size. So there's pros and cons if you think about it from like a researcher's perspective. Um, so yeah, we required them to have at least 1 year of training experience, and then to be able to squat 1.5 times body weight for the male participants, and bench body weight, and then those were just shifted down 0.25 as a scalar aspect of body weight for the female participants we had. So that is something that um, allows us to ensure that it's decently translational to the populations who we're trying to extrapolate it to. And So yeah, that I think that's good to step in the right direction. Um, you can absolutely institute higher strength standards or more experience, but what ends up happening is you just have to wait longer until you get people in the study. Um,
Hmm.
Another downside to the way we did it is that you can get people like I would qualify for the study, you know, um, but then so would someone who's literally just been lifting a year and has made solid progress. Should we be compared? Especially with a small sample size. If I get randomized into one group and they get randomized into another, is it really the effect of the group assignment, or is it or is it heavily confounded by the fact that I might not be able to gain muscle at, let's say, that 15% surplus group. And they would have actually benefited from going there because they've still got, they're only 60% towards their, let's say, theoretical maximum muscle potential. I'm 95% there. I mean, I'm just guessing, right? But I think you can see how there are concessions that have to be made when you're making studies like this, unfortunately. But we get a little closer and we keep chipping away at it. That's kind of the perspective we have.
Yeah, each study, the way I see it, is a piece of a much larger puzzle.
100%. That's a great perspective.
And so you had these trained lifters, and trained is exactly what you defined just now. And my understanding is that they were divided into three different groups. One
hmm
training at maintenance energy, one in a 5% surplus, and one in a 15% surplus. And they were all training 3 days per week for 8 weeks. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, we had there was basically a maintenance phase, so kind of an initial.
Yes.
They expressed their interests to kind of give a peek behind the curtain. We would advertise the study. Someone would say, "Hey, I'd love to be in your study." We go, "Fantastic." We put them in touch with our Dr. Alyssa Joy Spence, and she would ensure that they'd meet up, talk through things, verbally get the idea. Do they fit into the study criteria? And then we'd also just kind of do a familiarization session on squat and bench press, which were included on each day, just to make sure they can reach the standards. Can they squat to depth, safely and comfortably? Is that something they've done? They did have to be squatting and benching in their regular training, just so that we didn't see familiarization effects really kind of amplifying their strength, or have a suppressed pre-test 1RM, and then they get really really good at squatting and benching rather than it being representative of quote unquote more stable strength gains.
Hmm.
Uh, and then from there, if they were able to, okay, we know they can do the training and they're an appropriate participant for the study, they would go into a maintenance phase. And then for most of the study, that was Steve Taylor. He was the dietitian who helped us, also the Team 3DMJ dietitian. And he basically acted as each one of the participants' coaches. And he helped them get within a stable body weight range, where for a couple of weeks they were only plus or minus 1% of their body mass. So we got them to maintenance, and then they would be randomly assigned to either a maintenance group, a 5% surplus, or a 15% surplus, which we had objective definitions for their average body weight change occurring on a week-to-week basis. And yeah, one thing I may be jumping ahead to a question you're going to ask, but the the process of doing that is not necessarily clean. Asking someone to be in a 5% surplus, it's small. So I mean, if you think about it, if you have a maintenance energy intake of 3,000 calories, that's only 150 calorie surplus, right? So the type of body weight gain you can see is going to be easily eclipsed by like water weight changes and just the typical fluctuations we all see on a day-to-day basis. Um, and the maintenance group, that plus or minus factor is, that is also potentially like, oh, you could be in a surplus of 1 week, oh, and then we're going to bring you back into like a deficit or whatever. So it is not by any means necessarily a really, really clean distinction between these groups. And when you look at the table in the preprint, you can see between the two surplus groups, they actually had the same mean change in body weight. So that right there goes to show you that even when you've got a coach working with you, experienced dietitian, he's been doing this for years, objective criteria, you screen people, you take them through a maintenance phase, you teach them how to track, and you're doing regular check-ins, it's not necessarily going to be the cleanest thing in the world. So, and when you have a small sample size, like we did, which because we got basically blown up multiple times by COVID lockdowns, We got a couple people hanging in the maintenance phase, one or two people training, and then we lose all four of them, right? That happened three times. So
Wow.
yeah, our initial plan was to recruit in the high number of 30s of people, so that with attrition we had, roughly 10 per group. And what we ended up with was we recruited 21, and then the final number in the analysis was 17. So we're talking slightly more than half the participants we thought we would have. So we're comparing groups of five or six. So you get, one person, like that example I gave earlier of myself, or someone who will only be training a year, who gets randomized into these two different groups that might bias that covariate, and it can really have an outsized impact on the outcomes. So that's just called sampling variance. When you sample from a population, and the variance that you get in those random group assignments from that sample, it can mean that if you reran the study, you would get some degree of difference. So our initial decision of how we were going to analyze this was to do group by group comparisons. And what we decided post hoc, based upon the fact that, hey, we ran out of money. And first off, one thing I do need to say is big thanks to Legion Athletics. They funded the study. And then we also used some of the research grant money that I was given by Renaissance Periodization to fill out the rest of that, paying Steve as being the dietitian, a large part of that. All of it just went right into the study, by the way, paying basically the research assistants for their time. So anyway, couldn't have done it without them, and appreciate their patience for us taking, 5 years almost, and because of COVID, and also only getting through with 55-60% of the participants we expected. But I think we were able to salvage the data in a way by which we did what's called a regression analysis. So most sports science and nutrition science, I should say sports nutrition science, you're going to see group versus group comparisons. And that's great. And sometimes that's the most appropriate analysis to do. But when you can, and you can leverage the full strength of the sample size you have, if you can do what's called a continuous analysis, then you get a much stronger statistical power. So because we saw a lot of variance in how much body weight people gained, right? So in the maintenance group, not everyone was perfectly at maintenance. In
Hmm.
the small surplus group, like we said, the mean change was the same as the large surplus group, which means there are people in the small surplus group who are gaining too quick relative to what we are trying to do, and the opposite in the large surplus group. We had
Hmm.
said, oh, what we've actually got here is a range of body weight changes over these 8 weeks, and the actual independent and dependent variables we're looking at here is surplus and gain in muscle mass, right? And surplus, we're literally defining as, or operationally defining as, the change in body mass over time. So that is something that occurred in a continuous manner across all participants. So why not take the whole 17 participants and simply do a regression analysis, which is basically just a correlation between looking at the change in body mass and how that related to the change in muscle thickness that we measured via ultrasound, 1 RM in squat and bench press, and also the 8-site ISAC skin fold changes, which is just high quality, very precise skin fold analysis. And that was actually quite good. And that is more statistical power than even we had planned if we'd gotten a full sample. If we'd had 10 versus 10 versus 10, we're looking at samples of 10. But now we've got a sample of 17 people, and we can have a lot more confidence in the relationships that we looked at, which was really good because once we decided to do that, I kind of felt like, all right, good. We didn't waste 5 years and all this time and money invested in this, and I was able to sleep at night. So
So what I understand that you're saying is that by utilizing this approach, you made this well, you feel that you have now more confidence in the results that you found.
at least part of them. So an interesting thing, if you look at the group versus group comparisons, you'll actually see that, for example, bench press 1 RM was
Mm-hmm.
better in the moderate surplus group. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that's an example of sampling variance, because
Mm-hmm.
once you took the whole sample and you regressed body mass and you looked at differences in strength, there wasn't a relationship between strength gain and the total amount of lean mass gained for each participant. So when that goes away, it tells you, okay, you just happen to get someone who, for whatever reason, that's not related to the variable you're manipulating, which is the surplus size or the weight gained, got stronger, and they were in that group. Or maybe you got two people, and two people doesn't sound like a lot, but when you only have five people in a group, that's 40% of them, right? So that's enough when you're doing these small group-based comparisons to push the inference towards going, oh, that was a better group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Small caveat for those interested in stats, which is I'm sure like zero people listening, but I have to say it anyway. We use what's called a Bayesian analysis. So if people are used to looking at studies, they're typically going to hear things like statistically significant. And that's not something you're going to see in the Bayes analysis. What they typically have is a Bayes factor, what is sometimes called a BF10.
Mm-hmm.
And that just basically is uh, the likelihood of one hypothesis being greater than the other. So if you see a BF factor of, say, 2 favoring the moderate surplus group, that means, you know what, it's twice as likely that what they did was beneficial than the other group. So it's a little more of an intuitive understanding, because if you ask most people, what does actually p less than 0.05 mean? They're like, I don't know, like, but and even when you explain it, it's non-intuitive. That's actually the chance that the observed difference between groups was by chance, you know. So it's the probability, that's what the p stands for, of any difference in the means being, due to chance. And we go, well, if it's only a 5% chance or less, then we're going to go ahead and say that is a true difference. So null hypothesis testing is relatively obscure anyway, and it does have problems. It's hard to interpret, and then also it doesn't necessarily really give you an intuitive sense of, all right, what's the likelihood and probabilities here? So we use Bayes factors, Bayesian analysis, which we think is probably better for these types of sample sizes as well, because it can give you just a more kind of continuous assessment rather than the kind of cutoff, like, oh, 0.07, well, nothing, 0.05, oh my God, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of, black and white thinking, which we're trying to get away from more and more when we have probabilistic understandings of how data kind of shakes out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So my understanding is that what you wanted to determine was if skin fold thicknesses, the 1RM performance in squat and bench, and then the muscle thicknesses measured by ultrasound in the biceps and the quads were influenced by being at maintenance in a smaller surplus or in a bigger surplus. And so in the conclusion section, I was reading about the fact that your conclusion, yeah, was that faster rates of body mass gain, and so being in a larger surplus, seem to increase the gain in skin fold thicknesses. But in this particular study, it didn't seem to also improve 1RM and muscle thicknesses to the same degree or to the same extent. Is that right?
Yeah, high level, 100%. Just some minor things as we got biceps, triceps, and quadricep muscle thicknesses.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at a couple different
Ah.
upper body sites. But yeah, I mean the the thing which I think is important actually, because we did find some weak evidence in favor of higher rates of weight, or there being a positive relationship, I should say, with weight gain
Mm-hmm.
and bicep thickness increases. But the strength of that evidence, when we look at those Bayes factors and just basically a regression, it gives you like an R score. People are familiar with it. It's a very simple Pearson's correlation. You get an R score. Um, we had we had strong evidence, if we were to qualitatively describe the strength of the quantitative numbers that we got from our Bayesian regression,
Mm-hmm.
between increases in skin folds and body weight. So,
Mm-hmm.
if we were to plot a linear line, a lot of those dots would be relatively close to it. It does look like a linear relationship. And, as you slide up, you're seeing an increase in 8-site skin fold thicknesses as you're seeing an increase in body weight. And then if you shift over to 1RM strength in squat or bench, if you were to plot it, scatter plot all over the place, no clear line, right? Same thing for triceps muscle thickness, same thing for quadriceps muscle thickness. But for biceps, there's a little bit of a cloud where you can kind of see it's semi linear. And we had what would be qualitatively described as weak evidence of a positive relationship between gains in body mass and increases in biceps muscle thickness only, which is interesting. But for
Hmm.
the most part, the strongest evidence we had, if we were going to, hang our hat on something, and also as just kind of go back to my prior point, if we were to have used null hypothesis significant testing, we didn't. So I don't know this to be the case, but I suspect the only significant relationship we would have found would have been between body fat and mass gains. So
Hmm.
I think that's to give someone an idea of the kind of strength of relationships we're talking about here. So absolutely, yeah. The regardless of whether someone was closer to weight maintenance or gaining a little more quickly, that didn't seem to impact their strength, triceps or quadriceps muscle thickness, but it did seem to have a pretty clear relationship with the total increase in skin folds over the 8 weeks that they were training.
So the way I'm looking at these results, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the following. So usually skin fold thicknesses are used as a proxy for body fat gain,
Hmm.
whereas we use muscle thicknesses as a proxy for increases in muscle size. And also we, in this case, I'm assuming that 1 RM performance was used because normally if you are increasing your muscle size, then you are also your performance is also in many cases likely to increase over time. So when you're finding that if you gain body mass at a faster rate and your skin fold thicknesses are also going up, but that's really the only large change that you can see, then my understanding is that then a larger surplus doesn't really result in more muscle mass gain, but only in a faster rate of body fat gain. Whereas whether you are in a smaller surplus or in a larger surplus, the rate of muscle gain seems to be the same. That's how I'm interpreting these results. Would that be right, or do you have any corrections to make or any further thoughts?
Ah, you're on point, and I think the further thoughts I have is that we are absolutely constrained to the structure and the limitations of the study. So this was an 8 week study. It's possible that with a longer time period, we would have been able to see clearer differences. The only downside to that is I don't think the skin fold change would have dropped off, right? So you would have seen potentially, oh yeah, larger surpluses do increase strength and muscle mass more. But, after 16 weeks, now you've got a fair amount of body fat that came with it. And that may be worth it for someone who is, say, like an American football, lineman who they just want to get bigger and stronger, because if they weigh
Hmm.
more, it's harder for you to push them over, right? Sumo wrestler, I think we don't want to take too much of a bodybuilding lens on this. There's a time and a place for different goals, right? Equipped powerlifter, there's a lot of discussion around the fact that when you're wearing, say, single ply or multiply equipment, that the body dimensions and geometry and mass you have, to some degree, irrespective of whether it's contractile tissue or adipose tissue, allows to put a little more stretch on the shirt and the squat suit. And being bigger can sometimes just help you being stronger. So, and the relationship between strength and hypertrophy is also one that is complex. And absolutely, contractile tissue over a long enough period and people who are well experienced, you should see some relationship there. But perhaps over 8 weeks, you wouldn't expect, even if there had been more muscle gain, to really see the difference kind of manifest in the 1 RM testing. So those are all caveats. Another caveat is that we were training them 3 times a week. And that
Hmm.
probably was similar to the amount of training that some of these participants were doing, maybe even more than a couple if they were training hard 2 times a week recently. But it was absolutely probably a decrease in total training frequency and volume for a fair number of the participants who joined the study. And we tried to make up for that by making it a pretty hard program. They were doing squat and bench press on all 3 days of the week that they came in, and they
Hmm.
were doing 3 accessory movements. We followed basically a linear progression that wasn't like super, super powerlifting style. Like the reps didn't get that low; they got down to like 4 reps from 10.
Mm.
And the RPEs rose. The strength and the bench press were basically ran through a percentage based system with a correction based upon RPE. So,
Okay.
for example, something might be like, hey, 3 by 8 at 75%. And by the way, that should be a 0 to 2 RIR or a 2 to 4 RIR. So they'd run
Hmm.
the first set based on the percentage and also based upon what did they do last week. And so it's this individualized adjustment. Oh, and if that first set at that percentage or based upon last week's was too low or too high of an RIR, then we just adjust the load to get you back in that range. So the compound lifts were maintained in a moderate but still submaximal difficulty, and with a linear increase in load and a linear decrease in reps. It's kind of like a typical strength program. But then they would have a back exercise and a shoulder exercise and a biceps exercise every day, 3 sets to failure. And I know my students and my colleagues, they're pushing them hard. So the hard work that they were doing was good, but it's 3 times a week. Now,
Mm-hmm.
with that said, I suspect that there's not many people who are training in this study and training their biceps 4 times a week, or training squats 4 times a week or bench 4 times a week. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that our targeted analysis, looking at, triceps with benching all the time, quads with squatting all the time, and biceps with doing biceps and back work every single day, hopefully skirts this limitation.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to do something like, say, DEXA or just overall lean mass, I think it might be like, they're not getting the same total body volume, and that could be something that impacted the skin folds. That's something I've thought about. The reason why is that essentially when you've got a surplus, it's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Your body's got to pay for that, right? So if you have a lot of muscles that are acting as a calorie sink because they're generating muscle protein synthesis, they've gotten that signal to grow, then more of that surplus can be possibly dictated or directed, I mean, towards muscle mass gains. But if there are muscle groups that are just not getting trained, so for example, calves and hamstrings in this study didn't get a lot of love, if those muscle groups were seeing slight atrophy, or we're just kind of holding on and not doing anything, that's potentially a quote unquote missed opportunity for someone who's trying to gain as much muscle mass as possible, which means that those calories are going to go somewhere else, and that's going to be adipose tissue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there's the limitation is, we had reasonably well trained people and also some quite well trained people, 8 weeks, only training 3 days a week on what probably most people would describe a low to moderate volume program. And I would say the only muscle group which really got a moderate to moderate high volume through both direct and indirect work was the biceps. Because
Mm-hmm.
every day they're doing 3 sets on biceps and either 3 sets of lat pull downs or 3 sets of rows. So
Yeah, it's a hefty amount.
yeah, so it's at least it falls within like the meta-analytic ranges of what is quote unquote optimal volume. If we go to
Yes.
Schoenfeld 2017, or if we go to Basbal 2022, that have looked at different number of sets per week per muscle group, and they count it the same way, direct and indirect work, 10 plus or 12 to 20 sets. We fall in both of those ranges for the biceps, but we didn't meet it for a lot of the other muscle groups, and maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
why the biceps were the only muscle group which seems to have some relationship with weight gain. And they're always trained to failure too. So it was a moderate volume, high intensity program, um, relatively high frequency. And, in trained lifters, sometimes they have to push a little bit more volume or intensity or both to really see meaningful changes in a muscle mat or a muscle group over a short period of time, like 8 weeks. So I think this doesn't put the nail in the coffin by any means of don't ever bulk. Um, but it absolutely says, look, if you're going to do it, you've got to make sure you're growing. So if someone is following it kind of comes back to something I've said many, many times before, is that nutrition is permissive to gains,
Mm-hmm.
and your training program is what is going to create that initial stimulus. And
Mm-hmm.
if you create a good stimulus, but you don't support it, you're not going to get great gains. And if you create an inadequate stimulus and you over support it, then you're going to gain primarily body fat. So I think maybe we're seeing a mixture of that, where there wasn't a sufficient stimulus to support a large surplus or even a moderate surplus in this study for the quadriceps and triceps. But there was sufficient stimulus to benefit from a surplus for the biceps, and that's why there was a relationship there. Could it have been better? Maybe you wouldn't want to gain too quickly. You have to decide for your own purposes whether clear increases in skin folds is worth not so clear small increases in biceps.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining those limitations. And actually, it's interesting that you brought up the fact that nutrition is permissive, but training is the stimulus for muscle growth. Because I was thinking about the fact that in my coaching practice and also in my personal approach to gaining phases, I've been toying with the idea of scaling the surplus to the stimulus provided by the training. So, for example, if I have a client who wants to go into a gaining phase, but for them it's realistic to train 3 days per week only, then my approach is to skew their calories towards a surplus, but keep it moderate. So probably in the range of that 5% that you've mentioned, or as you said, it's really hard to track that, but within 5 and 10%. Whereas if somebody is telling me, well, I want to go into a gaining phase and I have the time to train 4 or 5 times per week, then I normally tend to scale the surplus so that it's a slightly bigger surplus than if somebody were training less often. What do you think about that?
I think that's a very reasonable approach, and I think it's funny so evidence-based practice, I think sometimes people go like, right, I can't make a decision unless I've got like, Helms et al. Or Goethe et al. Or whatever. Um, but I think really evidence-based practice, because only one of the three pillars of what it is actually being science-based, like actually being informed by the research.
Mm-hmm.
And the other two pieces are individual differences slash personal preferences, and the other one's experience. Um, and ultimately, I think what you do with the science, and I got to give a shout out to my mentor, Dr. Zerdos, on this, is understand that science is conceptual rather than specific. So,
Mm-hmm.
because of all the limitations I stated, as much as this is a translational piece of research that we conducted, um, ultimately you're not going to go, right, well, I got to train 3 days per week and I can't train my hamstring and calves. Like, of course not, right? So you have to go, okay, how do I take the concept that I learned from this study and how do I integrate it into my training? And that's exactly what you're doing there. You're saying, you know what? The biceps got the most stimulus. One of the inferences we can make from this, which is very reasonable based upon the limited data we have, which also is supported by the general principles of how we understand physiology works, and also my experience, and also the goals of my clients. They're interested in putting on muscle mass, but they don't want to gain a disproportionate amount of body fat. All of that together, I think, leads to that very reasonable practice, and that is what I would say is a perfect example of evidence-based practice.
Oh, thank you for that. I was interested in hearing your opinion. And another thought I had was you, in the study, you decided to use a percentage of energy maintenance. Whereas what I normally do is I set the surplus. I use as a target a certain rate of body weight gain per month. So for example, I will say I'm trying to achieve a surplus that will enable this person to gain between 0.75 and 1.5% of their body mass in a month. So I was curious to know what made you decide to go with a percentage of caloric intake instead of aiming for body weight gain over a certain period of time.
That was basically just propaganda, because ultimately when what we actually did and what the dietitian did to establish that was based on their body mass changes. So all of the adjustments that were made by Steve were based upon average changes in body mass over time. So
Mm,
functionally, what we were doing is the exact same thing as you. We
okay.
just extrapolated, we estimated using published equations what would we expect from these surpluses. So it's kind of a mixture of both. Um, and we wanted to cover both of those grounds because some people do think of, and it's very common, just as common as, like if you read my books, like I make a recommendation basically in line with what you said, try to gain X amount of weight, and then you just,
Hmm.
whatever surplus is needed to get there, because we care about the outcome. So I think that's a
Exactly.
very pragmatic approach, but there's just as many people who think of small surplus as 10%, moderate surplus is 20%, large surplus is 30%. So I wanted it to be something that was understood by everyone who read it, and it came from different kind of paradigms of thinking and schools of thought. But even the people who I know who use the 10, 20, or 30%, the adjustments, the quote unquote auto regulation, if you will, of their their gaining phase is based upon what they see in the mirror and what they see on the scale. So I thought what we chose to do, of setting the initial one based upon a increase over maintenance calories and then adjusting it based on body weight, probably captured the largest number of people and would be understood, by not only the peer reviewers. Hopefully, we'll see. One big caveat is this has not gone through peer review. It's a preprint, but also by all the readers who are intending to hopefully learn from it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying. And actually, something else that came to my mind as we were talking about this is in terms of the size of the surplus, another um, form of speculation that, or another thought I'm toying with is the relationship between the lifter's experience and and then the size of the surplus. So, for example, what I'm thinking is if somebody is more of a beginner, they have the potential to gain muscle at a faster rate. So, it would make sense to me to increase the size of the surplus versus so let's take somebody who trains 3 times per week, for example, and they're a beginner. Then maybe I would skew that surplus towards a 7% um, over over 7% extra calories over maintenance. Whereas if somebody was advanced, then I would skew it towards 5% because they're gonna gain body, but they're gonna gain muscle at a slower rate. So we want to again mitigate the gain in body fat. So have you found any relationship between potentially on an individual basis between the participants' training experience and the change in skin folds or muscle thicknesses, or both?
Great question. And if I was to give advice to anyone who wants to do further work in this area, because we do need it, is one, try to do it when there's not a global pandemic. First piece of advice. Second piece of advice is, well, that first piece of advice will allow you to get a larger sample than we had. And then you can start to have a little more confidence looking at these other relationships and covariates, just like you suggested. With a larger sample, you could confidently look at things like self-reported experience, like how many years you've been training. You
Mm-hmm.
could also just look at, say, fat-free mass index. So that's another kind of objective, more objective way of doing things. Body mass index is just height divided by body weight, right? And you can do the same thing with fat-free mass, and then you can kind of go, all right, on like if you have a large enough sample, like some people are born with like they walk around and they're at 23 fat-free mass index, and like they don't even lift weights, right? Other people, that's their cap when they're trained. So
Mm-hmm.
all these things are imperfect, but you could even run a regression and you could look at the relationship when you plug in years of experience, fat-free mass index, as well as relative strength. And if that starts to explain a lot of the variance in body mass gains as they relate to changes in muscle thickness, now we have some clearer support for that. And I think that would be pretty cool. I don't think we have the power to do it in ours. I mean, we have the ability. I don't mean the power in a colloquial sense. I mean the actual statistical power. You know, I wouldn't be confident in whatever we found. Let's put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
because we only have 17 people. But I think it would be very cool in future analyses for people to do exactly what you're describing. I think that's a very astute way of looking at the data.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As you can tell, I think a lot about how to gain muscle and what we could do in a scientific setting to understand that a lot more. I find it interesting how we know quite a lot about fat loss, which makes sense because of the obesity epidemic, but so very little, at least there is so very little research in muscle gain. There is so little we understand about hypertrophy and how muscle actually works.
You're not wrong. There's a lot. I mean, sports science is, I know it seems like a lot comes out. A lot of people talk about it. We have a very robust kind of quote unquote evidence based community, but in many ways, it's very much in its infancy. We've really only had the field of strength and conditioning for a handful of decades, so it is behind in many ways. And if you look at kind of how we operate versus some more advanced medical fields and the way people are studying, like you said, obesity, et cetera. We've got a lot of catching up to do. We're doing our best. And hey, if you ever want to waste many, many years of your life to become really knowledgeable in a very specific field while having other life skills atrophy, I would encourage you to definitely go into graduate school, Nikias, because with a mind like yours, I'm sure you'd do well.
Thank you so much. I actually have considered that. I have a degree already, and now with my full-time coaching business, there's a yeah. I have thought about it, but I don't know. I think I have the mind, but I don't have the patience, and I don't have uh, the love for that level of precision. I am not that
Mm.
precise, and I suck at statistics as well, which I think would be a problem.
Hey, so did I. Yeah, like it's definitely an opportunity to also work on. Uh, like I'm a big picture thinker. People probably think of me as a very analytical thinker because I'm a researcher, but I
Hmm.
think there is a certain bar you need to cross of like analyticalness, which is definitely not a word. Um, but and I've reached it, and it's good because then you can do things like look at study designs and learn a basic level of statistical analysis and go, oh, did they even does that make sense for what they did?
Hmm.
But there are people who are far more analytically minded than I am and far better at that. I'm sufficiently good, but because I'm a big picture thinker, I'm able to tie concepts together. And it's probably why I'm a good science communicator.
Hmm.
Um, and I can think about like I have an easier time writing a discussion. A lot of my colleagues have a much easier time writing the results. They can think about playing with the data, but to me, for me to understand the data, I have to think about how it fits into the overall picture of my understanding of how things operate, and that's what a
Hmm.
discussion is, right? So, you'll find different strengths lead you to different practices when you get into that environment. But if you ever want to take a pay cut, take a sleep cut, and like I said, probably not be able to handle as many clients as you currently can to answer a question that no one will care about in 4 years, we've got a spot for you. I'm saying
Thank you.
it's the
You're
good
really
life.
selling it to me. I gotta tell
Yeah,
you.
man.
I'm
Hmm.
halfway. I'm already writing my application over here.
Nearly out the door. About to get on a plane to New Zealand. That's right.
Oh well, that would be awesome actually. But thank you so much for covering that. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about a different topic, as I was alluding to before we started recording. But I got so excited about this one that now I don't want to do a disservice to the other one by introducing it when we have so little time. However, what you brought up, like we were talking about science communication, actually
Mm,
led to another question that I think will be interesting. And it circles back to the beginning when I was saying there is so much research that's been published. I also feel like that thanks to social media, there might be maybe even the same amount of research being published, but we just hear about it more because a lot of
mm,
people are talking about it. As soon as a study comes out or a preprint comes out, you find a lot of posts discussing it by different people, which I think is both a great change because there's more information being shared, but it also leads to potentially some people will jump to conclusions, or some people will misunderstand the findings. Some people will just be purely confused because they'll see these very scientific captions on Instagram, of all places, where we all go to look at cat pictures and memes. And they'll think, what the frick does all of this mean? So, my question to you would be, in this changing social media world where we have access to all of this information, if somebody isn't a researcher and doesn't understand science to the degree which you do, what would you suggest to look out for in terms of how do we know who to trust?
God, that's such a good question, Nikias, and I wish there was a very clear and easy answer. And it's something that I wrestle with on, if not daily basis, at least weekly. I think about this. Um, yeah, also I like the way you framed it, and I think I'm actually acutely aware of different parts of that framing. It is actually true that there's more research being published. That's something that I've learned in mass. When we first started, we had an estimation of like how much research is coming out in the fields of sports nutrition and exercise science on a monthly basis, and that number's gone up. And that number, when we first assessed it, was higher than it was not too long before that. So the field is growing. That's a good thing from the perspective of, if we've got more people taking shots on goal, we're going to get more points, right? There's going to be more useful information. It now allows for more meta analyses to be published, even if we don't have great sample great sample sizes that I discussed earlier. And so long as our methods are improving, then it won't just be like, saturating the airwaves with trash, which is a potential risk. And I think our methods are improving. And one of the ways which we can improve methods is what's called open science. And that is just the process of being more transparent and having more open data sharing, and having less things locked behind paywalls that people can't get access to. And one of the cornerstones of that is doing preprints. So that's why we got a preprint of this study. And that's why you've been mentioning in what you just said, there's a lot of people discussing this stuff. And that's before it's even come out. So for example, there's three big ones in addition to what we just released, the fourth, that are all preprints. So the meta-regressions that came out of FAU, led by Zach Robinson, who's a PhD candidate under Mike Zerdos, on
Hmm.
training to failure. That's something that we'll probably discuss in the future, it sounds like,
Yes,
which I'd love to be back on.
definitely.
So also Daniel Plotkin, who is at Auburn University. He's a PhD candidate, and he had a study that was funded by Brett Contreras, among other people, who compared squats versus hip thrusts, looking at glute hypertrophy and transfer to strength. And then there was also the deload study that came out of Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's lab over at Lehman, led by a PhD candidate, Max Coleman. So these are important studies. We have questions that are not clearly answered yet. What size of surplus is appropriate? Which exercise is better for the glutes? How do deloads operate? And
Yeah.
why did you laugh? That's a very important question.
This is because we went from a very big picture question, what surplus is appropriate for gaining, to which exercise is best for the glutes, this very specific muscle group. I was just laughing at that.
No, that was a subtle shot at Dr. Brett Contreras. I got to. I have to be a shit stirrer a little bit. So anyway, these four studies are all, regardless of whether they're big picture or specific, people in our space are very interested in them.
Yeah.
And none of those have been peer reviewed yet. So I think this goes to show that there is a lot changing, and for the most part, for the better. It is absolutely a good thing in the scientific community, but you're 100% right that as social media grows and as more stuff is published and as things are getting talked about before they're even published, it can be overwhelming. And I think
Hmm.
that's part of the reason why you're also seeing some, like, basically anti-intellectualism, or it's kind of like we see with COVID. There was people who were very distrustful of the powers that be and your traditional medical advice, and some of that was from the ball being dropped as far as the communication there, and having to move quickly, because it's an actual pandemic, not a theoretical virus, and science doesn't move quickly very well. And we saw a lot of misinformation, and there was actual dire consequences to that, right? So that has also been echoed in a much you know lower risk and reward environment in our space. Now you'll
Hmm.
see people confidently state, like, science is useless for bodybuilding, right? Not realizing that on a day-to-day basis they're using some principles that came from science that was done 10 years ago. And you'll get people who will literally state that the researchers themselves know less about the research than we can figure out, us citizen scientists, because we have the in the trenches experience. And they'll characterize someone like me as a pencil neck lab coat wearer who doesn't even lift weights, um, which is going to make my next show tough. I'm 6 weeks out and I don't even lift weights. What am I doing, right? So like there's absolutely some discourse that indicates that people are overwhelmed, understandably. It's too much. They feel like it's too much a focus on the science. People are being too rigid in their thinking, and some people are. And that's why I always kind of remind people those two other legs of evidence-based practice. The
Hmm.
interaction of social media makes it even more complex. Even if you are a good science communicator, it is challenging to shoehorn a non-overwhelming description of a study that captures the nuance appropriately when you're capped on words and you got a 90-second reel to do it, or when you've got to make it into not too many slides of infographics. Um, so, like you mentioned, Bill Campbell, who was on, who beat my number of views and engagement. He does a great job. It's a good example. He's got little quizzes on his Instagram. he's turned his Instagram profile, which is absolutely designed to get you to keep looking at cats, into an educational page on, nutrition and exercise science and physique science, if you will.
Hmm.
And that's something a lot of people in the space are trying to do, and to varying degrees of success. And I think the to some degree, it's not a problem that we have this kind of incestuous evidence-based community. So, like, a lot of the people who follow my work have a degree, are considering graduate work, maybe did a master's, might be getting into a PhD. And we have a lot of people who are publishing research who are themselves coaches, competitors, athletes, or just very, very serious about their own training, train others. It's rare to find someone who's a pure scientist now in our field. And I think that's because of the way it's been promoted and popularized and seen as a viable path. The only real example I had when I was coming up and starting my academic career, geez, and like in 2009 and earlier, 2007, 2008, when I really got started, was Lane Norton, you know, and there
Hmm.
was a few others like Dr. Joe Klinzewski. So um, representation it matters. That's true in a lot of facets of life. And for a guy like me who just wanted to be a bodybuilding scientist, I'm not sure I would have thought that was a thing unless I'd seen another quote unquote bodybuilding scientist, and there was an archetype for that. And now, a whole generation of people came up on that, and now we're almost 20 years past that, right? So we've had a couple of
Yeah.
generations of academia to do that. Um, so getting back to my point, we've got this incestuous kind of insular discussion. We've got this evidence-based crowd, and I think that's okay, because who they communicate to is then kind of another step removed. And that's people who are almost pure trainers who are trying to stay up to date. And that's challenging for them, but they've got a whole lot of people to talk to. And
Hmm.
so long as we do a good job at like the core root of that, and we've got people who are willing to listen to podcasts and not just consume Instagram information. Like they might have saw my 90-second green screen reel, which, here's what pisses me off, Nikias. Do you know how long it took me to do that 90-second reel?
2 hours.
Yes, exactly. You
Yeah,
know?
I know. I know that I definitely know the pain.
Yeah. So this podcast, we've done a far better job covering the results of that study. We're an hour in, so it's already 100% more time efficient. But for me, but unfortunately, it's not about me. It's about the people I'm trying to help. So
Yeah.
all the people who watched that clean 90-second green screen reel that did pretty well, they don't know that I was sitting there like, all right, I got to shave 2 seconds off this and still cover the methods. All right, I can't say the sites where the muscle thicknesses were. I just need to say muscle thicknesses. Actually, if I say muscle and skin thicknesses, then I can cover both. Like
Yes, I
I am,
understand completely.
yeah, I'm fighting over milliseconds here just to try to not leave anything out but say everything. And then okay, then I got the caption, and then I can also link them to the thing. But I know that with each step of that additional detail, I'm losing 20-30% of the audience. So it is absolutely a challenge. It's easy to get wrong, and you can't actually get everybody. But the way I see it is, look, if that got 70,000 views, which is incredible, right? Like, I just need the majority of the people, especially other content creators, to get it right, and for them to go out and do the same thing, so that it's not a game of telephone, but it's actually a tool of disseminating correct information. So I'm not the only one in the space, though. There's plenty of people who I saw jumped on. Like there was, I'm not even going to name names, but there was a quote unquote evidence based person who 20 minutes after the meta regression on failure dropped, they had a video on it. And I'm like, there's absolutely zero way you read through the whole methods of that. Like it took me a week to digest it, and then I talked about it on a podcast. And you made a video within 20 minutes that got posted on social media. And of course, it was a hot take that was largely wrong. So I think um, the competitive pressure to try to be the first to like, let's talk about this versus let's get it right, I think that's
Hmm.
misplaced in our community. People are going to want to hear from someone they trust and they connect with. So if you take a little longer to talk about something and it takes a week before it's on your podcast or what have you, but you get it right, I think that's far more important, because we really do need to plant the seed for it to grow right and not be taken the wrong way. Another really important thing is Daniel Plotkin, Max Coleman, myself, and as well as Zach Robinson, are the ones out there communicating things. And
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I try to explain to my colleagues a lot. Like just having a Twitter profile and just sending putting a link to when your thing goes to press to a paywalled, thing that's just an abstract for people to read. That's not impact. That's not research impact. You're not doing your job. We're not theoretical physicists, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sports science. So this isn't something that we don't want the stat to be true, which is true, that the average paper that's published is read by like 5 other researchers. Like fantastic, In sports science, we want it to be read by the practitioners and the athletes, and we want it to be understood by them, and we want it to be understood accurately so they can actually implement it. We are by nature, even yeah, I mean, might say I'm an applied exercise physiologist first, exercise physiologist, but all of it is applied on a relative scale when we look at all the different fields
Mm-hmm.
of academic inquiry. So if you're in nutrition, if you're in exercise, and you're in the research space, you are applied. You are translational, no matter whether you're working with mice, whether you're working with cell cultures, or whether you're like me, who's basically a glorified personal trainer. Then that's what you're doing, because it is meant to impact people. And if that is the case, we need to communicate to people. So when you do research, you need to have someone on your team who you trust or who can help you, or you yourself needs to do a little bit, not much more than you currently do, but just more than a throwaway PubMed link on your Twitter to actually get out there. Because if you don't do it, someone else will, and they're probably going to get it wrong. So I think being the actual person who did the research and then went out to communicate it to people is a very, very important piece of this puzzle. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's I imagine if these 4 preprints, if none of the people I just described were talking about them, there would absolutely be some things lost in translation. And I think that can do, echoing harm, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what I think, what I extrapolate from what you're saying, or rather, what I understand is that, so from your perspective, the perspective of the science communicator, actually contributing the studies, so conducting the studies and then communicating them is important. And then for the person on the receiving end of that to be able to trust the information provided, you're saying try to find the communicators who are also actually doing the studies so that their explanation is, well, the closest to what actually went on in the study because they kind of conducted it. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. So I would say, if you're someone out there just trying to get the information, when you can hear a description of what occurred from the person who did it, that's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. And it's not that you blindly listen to what I said about our study, but I think you want to have that perspective. So you want to, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is what they think they did and what they saw and what they reported and their view on it, which is the closest to the actual, lived experience of being, running the study. But,
Yes.
lived experience is lived experience, right? I mean, everyone justifies what they do in their own head, and they think they're the hero of their own story, and I'm a victim of that too. So it is absolutely good to then step out and hear other people's takes on it as well. The thing about blind spots is we're blind to them. So it's not like I'm going to be like, don't listen to Mike Israetel talk about my study because he didn't do it. It's like, well, maybe you should listen to Mike Israetel about my study because he didn't do it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I think you can be missing out if you don't get both.
Yeah, I agree. And then what I think you also implied, or at least what I thought you were saying, was don't just consume the Instagram post, but also look at long form content like this podcast or the mass research review. So if you don't have the tools to understand the actual study when you read it, look out for long form content discussing it rather than relying on just the 90-second reel or the 2000 character Instagram caption. Is that a correct interpretation of part of what you said?
Absolutely. And this is something that might sound a little harsh, but for people who don't have the time or the level of interest to listen to an hour-long podcast or read a 2 or 3,000 word article, to fully understand something, that's fine. But that's a mismatched perspective with, and I want to benefit from it and fully understand it. And that's what I see, not a lot, but enough. Like someone will ask me a question on Instagram about like, hey, I'm 6 foot, I'm 90 kilograms. These are my training experience for 3 years. And I haven't been able to make gains in my right bicep and my left is growing. What do you think about MAV in this? And I'm like, bruh, we're on the gram. Like, how, what can I tell you? I can tell you, like, if you save up $60 and buy my book, that's like and it's not going to sound good because I'm just like, like I need you to, there's nothing I can do for you. Like Instagram is not an educational platform, no matter how good, Bill Campbell is as turning his page into one. It's not designed for that. It's actually designed to keep you on there. Anytime I say anything in a caption or in a reel that even smells like leave Instagram, I go from, 1,000 likes to 100. Like it just guts my engagement. So that's just an example of what these platforms really are, and we need to be aware of that. Like
Mhm.
the tail is wagging the dog. And so if you are someone who wants to have a deeper understanding of the nuance rather than a surface level, which you don't need to, right? Like you can become, if you have the genetics and the consistency, a, a champion athlete without doing this. You have a coach who does the hard work for you, or maybe you're just a basic level student of the sport and you understand the key hits and you focus on the big rocks that we've known in the trenches for years. Fantastic. However, for someone like me who found that putting in that level of effort got me to not exactly where I wanted to go, and I wanted to see if I could maximize my potential, I decided, well, I'm actually going to turn over that stone of me learning everything I can about it, which of course then led to an academic career. You don't have to do that. I don't recommend it. Um, Everything I said earlier is obviously facetious and a lie, Nikias. Don't do your postgraduate work unless you really just want to nerd out for the rest of your life. But anyway, if you do want to get 100% out of the data that we have on this, then you're going to have to put forth an effort that matches that. And that requires you to probably swipe up on Instagram so it closes and actually listen to a podcast, read a paper, or read a research review. And there's a process there. Like for example, if you subscribe to Mass, we have an interpreting research document. We have research briefs. We have audio summaries so people can understand it. You don't have to read the criticisms and statistical musings section. You can read the key points and you can read the interpretation. Good to go. You don't have to read you can listen to this podcast instead of reading the actual full text preprint of the paper. And I don't think you're missing out on much unless you're really interested in how, what the actual strength of the Bayesian regression was, besides me just saying, you know, clear or unclear or small or moderate or large, evidence. So I think having that understanding, there's like an opt-in for each person, and that can change over time as you learn, is something that I think a lot of people don't get, and that's part of the overwhelm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Eric, I am really thankful for how generous you've been with your time. I'm aware that we're a little bit over, so I am going to end this obviously part one of our conversation here. But my three biggest takeaway points have been from this conversation that, at least from the study that you conducted, it seems like larger surpluses are not really more beneficial than smaller surpluses to mitigate body fat gain and maximize muscle gain. And then the second takeaway point is that training is really likely the most important variable between training and nutrition if you want to optimize muscle gain in a gaining phase or in any phase, really. And finally, stop being a lazy bum scrolling Instagram and go get some long form content if you really want to learn the nuances that science is trying to communicate. Do you think that this is a good summary of what we talked about?
Absolutely. Listen to this podcast and just keep listening to Nikias's podcasts, and you will be good in all facets of life. Is the big take home, I would say. But no. So in
Oh,
all seriousness, you nailed it.
thank you so much. So before we go, is there anything that you would like to direct people to? I will obviously have the link to the preprint, which is open access to everyone, in the show notes. But if there's anything else, let me know and I'll add the link.
Yeah, absolutely. If people really want to try to stay up to date with the research and get an understanding of how someone like myself or Dr. Eric Trexler, Mike Zerdos, or PhD candidate Lauren Conlon, how we interpret it, how we come to our conclusions and frame it, I would highly encourage them to consider Mass Research Review. Massresearchreview.com is where you would go, and you can see us actually go through on a monthly basis this information. And like I said, we got audio summaries, we got briefs, we got videos, we got full articles. That's probably the spot that I would recommend the most. And then just to stay up with the stuff I'm involved with, you'll probably see me post a picture or a reel related to this exact podcast episode on my Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Excellent. So I'll link people to the Mass Research Review and to your Instagram account. And Eric, again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on again.
And dear listeners, thank you for your time, for tuning in today, and until next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.